start. This is the third of our doctoral talks. We had Aaron Spivak in the late fall and Scott Kibner here recently in February. Both very, very fine textual talks, and today we're going to have a talk that is very existential, is that true? You said, but by a man who is also a text person, but he spent 3 years living in one of the main religious centers of Iran in Qom, and I think it'll be very interesting just to hear what his life was like there. He and his wife lived there, and their daughter was born there. And what that was like, you'll give us all the experiential material, the first-hand material. But he also spent 3 years in Cairo and Yemen prior to that, and I think among all the graduate students that we currently have, he is the most traveled in the Islamic world of anyone, and certainly maybe not just at present time, but so we're really happy to hear from you and to learn from your experience.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Pierce, and I am a first-year PhD student here in the Department of Religion. And last semester, Professor Mason asked if I'd be willing to share some of my experiences studying in the Middle East, particularly in Iran. And I thank him and the Institute for giving me this opportunity. I debated with myself for some time about what aspect of my studies to share today. I've just begun my doctoral program here, so I haven't decided on a topic for my dissertation, and I don't have a body of defined research that I can present to you. My experiences in the Middle East were never with one specific topic or thesis in mind. And so for this reason, I've taken a more personal route in my presentation, which will allow me some flexibility in terms of subject matter, and most importantly, will allow me to justify subjecting you to my personal slideshow. Therefore, today I want to offer you some reflections and observations drawn from my studies over the last 6 years, particularly from my time in Iran. I'll first take a few moments to explain some of the unique aspects of my background, which undoubtedly informs my subsequent studies, and recount some of the events that led up to my time in Iran. And I will then spend a few minutes discussing the specific nature of my work in Iran. And then I'll share some observations about religious education in Iran. And we'll have some time, hopefully, for hearing from you, your thoughts, discussion, having some questions and things like that. There are far too many interesting things about Iranian society to squeeze into such a short lecture like this. So I've only picked out just a few of the details that were interesting to me. So now let me go back for just a few minutes to how I got to Iran myself. And by offering a few autobiographical notes, I hope to make clear from where I draw some of my main points of comparison. I myself grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and no one in my family before me had ever gone to college for other than a vocational training, and I didn't at all foresee that I would become involved in academics. As a young adolescent, I became involved in a very conservative church, and this is important because my earliest interest in Islam and the Middle East was born out of a conviction that I would be a missionary to an area where there were the least Christians per capita. This, of course, led me to the Muslim world, and what in Christian missionary lingo is called the 1040 window. That is the 10 degrees longitude north of the equator to 40 degrees longitude south of the equator, which basically means North Africa and Middle East, Central Asia. This was a big part of my childhood. After high school, I attended a college that would prepare me to be a missionary to Muslims. I chose to attend a Christian liberal arts college in southeastern Tennessee called Bryan College. This all becomes relevant later. Named after orator William Jennings Bryan and situated in the historic town of Dayton, Tennessee, where the Scopes monkey trial occurred, famously depicted in the Inherent the Wind Broadway play and film, Bryan College is what most would call a Christian fundamentalist institution. In fact, that's why I went there. It was the type of community I'd come to believe in at the time. I majored in biblical studies and enjoyed the academic atmosphere immensely. Although I began to experience moments of disenchantment with evangelical Christianity while I was at Bryan, it didn't come into full fruition for a few years. My first encounter in the Middle East was during my junior year in my undergraduate studies. I participated in a study abroad program based in Cairo, Egypt, and was introduced to the academic study of Islam rather than the apologetic study of it. That semester gave me a vision for how I might pursue a different approach towards Islam based on genuine understanding rather than the desire to disprove it. It also helped sensitize me to many of the nuances of Middle Eastern cultures by spending time in several countries in the region, particularly in Israel and Palestine. After graduating college and getting married, my wife Laura and I spent 6 months traveling in the Middle East and Central Asia. My wife had lived in Pakistan as a teenager, and we both had a thirst to see as many Middle Eastern and Central Asian cities as possible. We tried to visit Iran on that trip, but were denied entry at the time. We eventually ended our trip in Egypt, where we found jobs and took up residence for over a year. In Egypt, Laurie worked at a publishing company, editing English language magazines, and I enrolled full-time in a small Catholic school called the Dar Kamboni Institute for Arabic Studies, which is a small satellite school of the Pontifical Institute for the Study of Arabic and Islam based in Rome. In retrospect, I think that this is one of the finest institutions at teaching Arabic in existence, and I regret that I only stayed there for 1 year. But another opportunity had come my way for the next year. I was offered a Fulbright fellowship to study the art of Quranic recitation in Yemen. Laurie and I spent the next year living in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, studying Arabic, and I will avoid the temptation of going into the details of Yemen and so for making just a few notes. Yemen is an anthropologist's dream. I don't think there is any settled community in the Middle East that has preserved as much of its traditional culture as has Yemen. The architecture is fabulously unique, and the old city of Sana'a is arguably the finest in the world. After our year in Yemen, Laurie and I began our studies in Iran. And I want to stop here to explain how we learned this program through which we were able to study in Iran. As I said before, we had tried to go to Iran once in 2000, but we were denied entry. Laurie had spent her teenage years in Peshawar, Pakistan, and learned Dari, the Afghan dialect of Farsi. She's a literature buff and wanted to study Persian literature in Iran for some time. I was also interested in Iran and knew that learning Farsi would help me meet my own goals as well. In a random internet search one night, the magical combination of words put into the Google search engine brought up a web page by the Mennonite Central Committee. MCC, as it is known, is the humanitarian aid and relief branch of the Mennonite and Brethren churches of North America. MCC was looking for a couple, ideally with some background in Christian theology, as well as some experience in the Middle East and some knowledge of Arabic and or Farsi, to participate in a 3-year student exchange program in Iran. We were shocked to find such an opportunity, and we did not let it pass us by. My interest in Islam at this point had fully departed from any missionary ambitions I had formerly had and blossomed into a desire to see greater mutual understanding between Christians and Muslims. Our host in Iran was the Imam Khomeini Education and Research Institute, which I'll refer to simply as the Institute, founded by the current supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, and headed by Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi. The Institute is a graduate degree granting institution of higher education that serves as a supplement to the more traditional Jose and balances with in between the Jose and the more Western university. And I'm going to speak more about that in a few moments. MCC and the Institute had arranged a program in the late 1990s which would enable 2 Iranian couples at a time from the Institute in Iran to study Christian theology and Western philosophy at the University of Toronto. and enabled 2 couples of MCCs choosing to study Islamic thought in Qom, Iran, at the Institute. The program began with the expressed intentions of both parties to build better Christian-Muslim relationships. This partnership between the Institute and MCC, now going on its 8th year, is unique and fascinating. Both working with MCC, before working with MCC, I had mistakenly conceived of Mennonites as isolated communities living without cars and electricity. As many of you already know, while there remain groups of Old Order Mennonites whose theology and way of life is similar to that of the Amish, by and large, most North American Mennonites blend in with their middle-class neighbors in the rural, suburban, and urban environments they inhabit. Mennonite congregations span the whole of the conservative to liberal spectrum, and most are committed to a theology of nonviolence. This pacifism, as well as a focus on simple living and surviving traces of their Dutch-German cultural heritage, are distinguishing traits of these congregations. MCC, the Mennonite Central Committee, reflects the values of its constituency not only in its domestic and international humanitarian and development work, but also through its peace-building efforts, through which it organizes and funds various projects throughout the world with hopes of bringing peace to areas of conflict. The Imam Khomeini Education and Research Institute in Iran is also very interesting. It is headed by Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi, whose name has appeared with increasing frequency in the Western press since President Ahmadinejad was elected in 2005. He is often said to be the personal spiritual advisor to the current president and to be the inspiration behind the current government's policies. While the actual relationship between Ahmadinejad and Ayatollah Misbah is unclear, Ayatollah Misbah was well known in Iran before this recent presidential election, largely due to his outspoken political conservatism and his honored position on the Council of Experts. He is, by anyone's assessment, one of Iran's arch conservatives. He has long represented those who desire a greater role of the ulama in Iranian politics and greater enforcement of Islamic values, as he interprets them anyway. He is often derogatively referred to as Ayatollah Timsah. Timsah, which rhymes with Misbah, means crocodile, thus making him Ayatollah Crocodile. But alongside this political conservatism within Qom's schools, he is also known for his creative approach to problem solving and his willingness to chart new paths. One way in which this is manifested is the partnership that he actively sought out with MCC. It was the first of such programs to have been established in Iran since the revolution, and probably the first to have ever been established in Qom. There is no knowledge of Christians ever residing in Qom prior to this program. The city's identity has been wrapped around Islamic education since medieval times, and in this regard, I have no doubt about the sincerity of Ayatollah Misbah's motives. When we first arrived in Iran, he met with us and told us very clearly that there were bound to be people who would invite us to become Muslim, but that was not his intention or the institution's intention in having us there. If we were ever began to feel like we wanted to become Muslim ourselves, we should go back to America, he said. He wanted us to come there. He invited us there to be students so that their students could learn about Christians and Christianity, that we might learn more about Muslims and Iranian culture. Needless to say, the relationships that have formed out of this partnership have been rich, even if the two parties often strongly disagree on matters. Our daily life during our 3 years in Qom was surprisingly mundane. The first school year was mostly spent in full-time language instruction. The second consisted of a handful of courses that were tutored to us, usually in English, somewhat in Farsi, on a variety of topics: Quran, Shia Islam, Islamic history, Islamic mysticism. The third year was split between a continuation of tutored courses, by that time usually in Farsi, and the opportunity to audit courses of our own choice at the Institute. We took courses in Iranian history, Islamic philosophy, Persian literature, Arabic, theology, and so forth. We were provided an apartment by the Institute and given a stipend to use on food and other necessities. Qom is not known for its entertainment options, thus the majority of our time was either spent at home studying or visiting friends' houses. I am actually going to be giving a paper on the 31st of March at Boston College on some of the details of MCC's approach to interfaith bridge building. And if anyone is interested in that, I would encourage you to consider coming. So I now want to turn to the main points of my lecture. Some observations that I hope will be of interest to you. First, I wanted to make some comments about the city of Qom itself. Most of our time was spent in Qom, always to the shock and often to the horror of Iranians that we met in the rest of the country. Qom is not like any other city in Iran, and I'd venture to say that most Iranians have a rather negative impression of Qom. This means that when foreigners come to Iran, Iranians are very hesitant to take them to Qom. And thus, Qom is one place in Iran that seems to be the least known in the West, apart from it being an important place of Shia learning and political influence. Qom is a city of 1 million inhabitants, but it feels much more like a small town. It lies just 2 hours south of the capital, Tehran. The history of Qom goes back at least as far as the 5th century BCE, and there are some archaeological findings that suggest it was once a large regional city. Unfortunately, few details are known regarding the city until the Islamic conquests. Like much of the Persian lands, Qom fell to the Arabs during the reign of Umar, the second Sunni caliph. Its Shi'i character developed very early, and Qom served as a refuge for anti-Umayyad activists. It had also become a key place for Shi'i scholarship during the Abbasid period, but was later restricted in this regard under the Seljuks. It was not until the 15th and 16th centuries under the Safavid Empire that Qom began to blossom into a genuinely important location for Shia studies and pilgrimage. The growing prominence afforded to it continued on through the Qajar period, and although the clerical establishment was under near constant strain under the Pahlavis, since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Qom has emerged as the premier center of Shia scholarship, often a rivalry with Najaf in Iraq. Other than academics, Qom today has little industry to speak of, though its silk carpets have long been famous and continue to be produced. Some mineral mining is done on the outskirts of town, and large numbers of bricks are produced for use in construction of houses. However, it is the seminary system that drives Qom, and the city would fall apart without it. Several factors make Qom unique. The most obvious is the presence of the shrine to Fatima Masumeh, the daughter of the 7th Twelver Shia Imam, Musa bin Ja'far al-Kazem. Fatima died in 816 of the Common Era. Several shrines have been built and rebuilt around her grave over the centuries. The current structure is primarily dated to the 17th and the late 19th century. But there have been significant additions completed in the last few years while we were there as well. I can attest to that visiting the shrine of Fatima is an exquisite experience, one that I often repeated during my time in Iran. The main entrance is covered with thousands of tiny mirrors, each tilted in different directions, creating a mesmerizing effect, which was strongly reminiscent of the Shia shrine in Damascus for As-Sayyida Zainab, if any of you have been there. Inside Qom's shrine, the intricate tile work, soft green marble, and thick carpets all combine to create an aesthetic of bliss. Pilgrims come from all around the world to visit the shrine. Many Iranians make a point to go regularly to Qom for this purpose. Shi'ism, unlike many Sunni circles, puts a great value on ziyarat, the visiting of saints' shrines, particularly the Imams al-Days, the shrines devoted to the family members of the Imams. Another important aspect of Qom's identity is the Jamkaran Mosque. Located on the southeastern outskirts of Qom, this mosque was commissioned by Sheikh Hassan and Mutlih Jamkarani in 983 of the Common Era, after having a vision where the 12th Imam instructed him to do so. The 12th Imam, also called the Mahdi, is believed to have been hidden since the end of the 9th century. He is expected to return, some say along with Jesus, in the last days in order to usher in the final age. In Iran, it is widely believed that Jamkaran is not only a site that the Mahdi continues to regularly visit. There is a well there, actually, where people would write prayers and put their prayers into the well that he might read them. But it is also widely believed that he will make his first public appearance in this place. The structure of the mosque itself is fairly uninspiring, but the role that the mosque plays in popular Iranian piety arguably surpasses all other sites in Iran. The third aspect of Qom's identity that I want to talk about, and this is where I'll spend the bulk of my time, is around the seminary system. The Hosea Ilmi, or more often simply referred to as the Hosea. Home to over 10,000 students and dozens of seminaries and universities, Qom revolves around the religious education system. The scholarship is very vibrant, and I brought a few books that I might pass around one at a time, illustrating different aspects of scholarship going on in Qom today. This is a new translation of the Quran by Qara'i, where it's an attempt to sort of give a little bit of a Shia translation on things to compete with many of the English translations that have been largely from a Sunni perspective. But it's an excellent translation. Qom has a disproportionate amount of ayatollahs and grand ayatollahs, further buttressing the city's religious identity. I might note here that ayatollahs are a diverse group, and their opinions on religious matters and other matters occupy a wide spectrum. There are even recognized women ayatollahs, though they're rare. And at the next level up, the grand ayatollah, or the marja, there is a diversity of opinion that can be felt in very real ways. Ayatollah Muntazadi, although he remains under house arrest, is still recognized as a legitimate authority and marja. There's also the mystically inclined Ayatollah Hassan Zadeh al-Mali, who has a more mystical bent to his interpretations. The contemporary dialogue between the numerous ayatollahs and grand ayatollahs is vibrant. It plays itself out in Iranians' lives in significant ways, since mainstream Shiism teaches that each individual should choose a qualified marja, that's like a guide, someone that you would follow them in matters of religious law. In Iran, even our lives as non-Muslims were affected by this choice of marja. A particularly illustrative example of this would be the issue of physical contact with non-Muslims. Some grand ayatollahs have ruled that non-Muslims are inherently najas, ritually impure. This means that physical contact with them is discouraged. This opinion has been steadily dying out among the Shia ulama, but just 50 years ago, in Iran at least, this judicial opinion was fairly common. And one of my professors, Hussein Tawfiqi, used to tell us stories of his childhood when he lived in Kafshan, a city just east of Qom. He could remember that when it rained, the local radio and news stations would politely ask the non-Muslims to remain in their house while it was raining so that the water would not transmit their ritual impurity to the rest of the population. The current supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, probably the most widely followed of the grand ayatollahs today in Iran, has made a consistent practice, however, of declaring rulings that make life and contact with non-Muslims, even those who are not people of the book, to be a less religiously complicated task. Despite this trend, however, it remains an issue, even in a city, especially in a city like Qom. When one of our predecessors in Iran attempted to join a local volleyball club, several of the other girls on the team felt the need to withdraw from the team for fear of her sweat getting on the ball and then transmitting her ritual impurity. Coming back to the Hosea itself, the term Hosea is broadly used to encompass all the advanced religious education that one would pursue, typically beginning after secondary school. The word is an Arabic import, hawza, literally meaning area or domain. So that Hosea Ilmi is thus literally area of knowledge. Michael Fisher, in his book, Iran From Religious Dispute to Revolution, gives some description of the three main levels of study in the Hosea of Qom. Level 1 is referred to as the Muqaddamat, the preliminaries, where the student primarily studies Arabic grammar, syntax, etymology, and rhetoric. Let me make sure I didn't miss something here. Level 2 is listed as that, the subject matter itself, where the student takes on the main subjects of fiqh and usul al-fiqh. Level 3 is called the kharij, those studies which are outside of the texts. And in this third level, the student works closely with one or a few ayatollahs until he or she has reached their personal goal, whatever that may be. Under electives, Fisher lists akhlaq, moral philosophy, tafsir, commentary on the Quran, and hikmat, philosophy. This is a helpful guide. However, I would add a few comments. First of all, the entry and exit points of this program, as well as the internal stages of progress, are almost entirely fluid. This is both the strength and the weakness of the Jose. On this point, I quote Fisher in a section titled "The Madrasa as a Free University," where he says, quote, "The picture that members of the madrasa system draw of the secular schools stresses their coercive and anti-learning nature in contrast to greater freedom and more learning for learning's sake in the madrasas. In the state institutions, students are forced to take classes they do not like. They are pressured to study for grades and for diplomas rather than for knowledge. But both teachers and students anxiously await release by the bell at the end of the class period. Students and teachers often do not respect each other. Teachers pontificate. Students are captive audiences rather than partners in learning. The pedagogical ideal of the madrasa is just the reverse." End quote. And I heard this perspective articulated to me time and time again as a source of pride among both teachers and students in the Jose. And while this is certainly an idealized picture in some ways, and I found that a professor being annoyed at his or her students sleeping in class is apparently a universal phenomenon, still, the freedom bestowed upon a student is striking. Students study whatever they can find a qualified teacher to teach. Depending on the student's background, before entering the Jose, an individual might be studying subjects at all three levels at once, and never take one course on fiqh. The interests and the needs of the student rule supreme. If compared to economic policies, one might say that the university adopts a more socialist model, while the Jose uses a more capitalistic, market-driven approach. It must also be noted, however, that since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Jose has seen some slow changes in this regard, notably the gradual implementation of regulations and tests. One key reason for this was to guarantee that those who were receiving the student stipend were actually students making some kind of progress in the Jose. However, progress continues to be very liberally judged. While a highly motivated student with a good educational background might move through all three of these levels in as little as 6 years, taking 10 to 15 years is more common, often coupling it with part-time work as a teacher, researcher, or preacher. It's not uncommon to come across students that have continued to study for decades. In fact, with no formal graduation point, many students continue their studies indefinitely. Another clarification I would add to Fisher's description of the coursework in the Jose of Qom is the increasing diversification of subject matter taught and approved by the ulama. Many students in Qom expressed to me that fiqh is simply too boring and tedious for most students to pursue, or as they would say, dars fiqh khayli khaste konen dars. There has been, therefore, a rapidly growing interest in the humanities, particularly sociology, psychology, and philosophy of religion. The Imam Khomeini Institute, where I studied, is a prime example of this growing field and the ulama's response to this interest. Founded in 1995 by Ayatollah Khamenei, the school is one of several institutions trying to bridge the gap between the secular university and the Jose. It serves as a supplement to the Jose, where students can receive formal degrees, MAs, PhDs, in political theory, sociology, world religions, philosophy, theology, economics, so forth. The methodology of these types of institutions blends that of the university and with that of the Jose. And it struck me just today as I was reading over my notes, and I'm going to be making some more comparisons with my background at Bryan College in a few moments, but this is another one here, that Bryan College terms itself a Christian liberal arts institution, which explicitly is trying to blend what you would get at a Bible college, with the religious education being part of the core curriculum for all students, no matter what discipline you're in, similar to what the Institute has. They have a core curriculum that is part of the Jose, which everyone must participate in, but taking on some of the academic subjects of the university, seen as secular and somewhat threatening, and implementing them into a more safe environment. Let me give you some examples, though, of how the differences between the university and Jose play out in Iran. In the university, classes are taught in classrooms with desks. In Jose, classes are taught on the floor, usually in a shrine, in a mosque, or in the home of a teacher. In the university, course readings would consist of several books of different authors on a given topic, all to be concluded within a time period of a semester or 2 semesters. In the Jose, classes are generally taught out of one book and last as long as it takes to get through that one book, be it half a semester or 3.5 semesters. In the university, students are expected to defer to the authority of their teacher and not argue excessively. In the Jose, the dialectical process is seen as crucial. The good student is expected to challenge the teacher on many points and to attempt to defend his or her position vis-a-vis the teacher's opinion. In the university, classes are co-ed. In the Jose, classes are gender segregated. Although male teachers do frequently teach all female classes, but they would do this from a curtain that is put up in front of the class. I'm not aware of any women teachers teaching all male classes, but I actually wouldn't be surprised if this did exist somewhere in Poland. The Imam Khomeini Institute is a part of a new branch of the Jose, which attempts to incorporate some of the disciplines and methods of the university while keeping some of the parts of the Jose as well. And I picked up just one of the textbooks from one of my classes at the Institute, and this is all Farsi, but may be of interest to anyone who knows some Farsi. This is written by Ayatollah Misbah. He has a whole set of books in which he is mapping out a new methodology in the Islamic sciences. This book, Rah Nama Shanasi, is the way and the introduction to the way and the guide of the way. Essentially, it's a book on prophetology, revelation and the prophets from the perspective of the Quran. But what he does here is mix methods you would find in tafsir literature with sociology, with some Western critiques of religion, all blended together into sort of a multidisciplinary approach to subject issues that's going throughout this whole volume, the whole series of volumes. In the interest of time, I'm going to use the remaining section of my lecture to offer some brief descriptions of several aspects of poem that I found interesting, of the academics of poem that I found interesting. The following points are in no particular order and don't have any necessary relation to one another. They're just a hodgepodge of observations. There's a deep fixation on pak and najas, ritually pure and impure. Unlike anything I encountered in Egypt or Yemen, I couldn't help wondering if obsessive-compulsive disorder was endemic in Iran. I originally assumed this unique quality to be rooted in Shi'ism, and it wasn't until later, after becoming more aware of Zoroastrianism, that I began to think that it may also have particularly Iranian roots as well. Whatever the roots, it's a very real phenomenon, often referred to as basbas, that is, obsessive doubt about ritual. Teachers in the seminary sometimes warn of the dangers of becoming basbasi. And famous examples are often cited of students who can't bring themselves to leave their houses or finish their ablutions for fear that they might have done something wrong, rendering themselves najas. This phenomenon seemed to be particularly present in areas of the country where there are few religious minorities, like Poland. The religious discourse that goes on in Qom is noticeably introverted. Arguably, all academic communities struggle with this issue, but I was particularly reminded of my own undergraduate studies while I was in Qom. When I studied Christian theology at Bryan College, there was a set of assumptions that were taken for granted, spoken or unspoken, which narrowly circumscribed the type of questions and concerns that could be raised. And it seems to me that when a religious community whose members share certain doctrines come together in an academic format, the convictions of the religious community easily become academic assumptions. This makes the discourse turn inward. Looking outward and engaging the discourse of those who do not hold those assumptions becomes unnecessary unless polemics are intended. And for instance, my only exposure to a dangerously liberal, what would be called a pseudo-Christian theologian like Karl Barth, was to learn a fail-safe argument against his heretical ways. Actually delving into such a figure's own writings was often seen as dangerous, or simply a waste of time. Similarly, in Qom, I encountered such an attitude. It did not take long for me to realize that the questions that I might bring to a given subject were often unwelcome, or more often simply misunderstood, largely due to the differing assumptions behind the questions. And similar to my experience as an undergraduate, certain dangerous thinkers were often singled out in class in order to definitively disprove them without needing to read their works. In this regard, Abdul Karim Soroush was a popular target. Soroush and Misbah have had a long-standing rivalry in the academic community in Iran. There actually was this funny instance where someone had decided to finally, this rivalry had existed, so let's set up a debate between Soroush and Misbah on some key issues. And somewhere along the line that fell through, so then they decided, well, let's set up a debate between Misbah's students and Soroush's students to debate each other. And then that fell through again, and then they said, let's have the students of the students debate the students of the students. And as you can tell, it just became absurd. But they don't do much conversing with one another face to face, but in their writings they frequently are arguing against each other. Another comparison to conservative Christian education that I noted has to do with the attitude towards studying the works of scholars of different viewpoints. In both my education at Bryan College and the Imam Khomeini Institute, there is a clear effort on the part of the professors to protect the students from the works or ideas that were deemed dangerous. That does not mean that they were forbidden from reading the works. It does mean that the work might not be available for purchase, might only be available for library use, and students were often strongly encouraged to refrain from reading the books unless guided by a teacher. This applied to perceived heresies in Iran like that of the Baha'i faith, as well as ideas that were believed to be true but dangerous. In the latter category fell some books of philosophy and mysticism. Ibn Arabi, for example, is widely studied in the Jose, but often highly discouraged for personal study. Despite the considerable success Shi'ism has historically had with reconciling philosophy with their religious scholarship, openly teaching philosophy in the Jose is quite novel in Qom. It was only relatively recently, notably with Al-Almay Tabatabai in the mid-20th century, that philosophy began to be openly taught in Qom. And it continues to be a debated subject in Qom. Similarly, I can remember at Bryan College, one of my professors confiding in me that he felt that some of the critiques of the doctrine of scriptural inerrancy had some value, some true aspects, but he didn't feel that that could be taught openly in the school, lest it be dangerous to the student's faith. Soon after moving to Qom, I was struck by the widespread mystical literacy. Islamic mysticism is exceptionally vibrant in nearly all circles of Iranians, and the Jose is no exception to this. It was surprising for me to see in Qom, because I had always understood Sufism to have a rather tense relationship with the ulama. Yet it seemed to be publicly endorsed by nearly all of the clerics, albeit to differing degrees. As time wore on, however, it became clear that Sufism did have a tense relationship with the clerical establishment in Qom, and Sufism was not, in fact, welcome there. The confusion is due to the Iranian Shi'i endorsement of irfan, a word literally meaning knowledge, but which refers to that form of Islamic mysticism which is seen by most clerics in Iran to be consistent with orthodoxy. Irfan, therefore, is not synonymous with Sufism, as I had originally assumed. At least it's not synonymous in Iran. While the vast majority of mystical principles shared by the two strains of thought, are shared by the two strains of thought, the clerics of Qom almost uniformly denounce the rituals that have formed as Sufism and the excessive power that the Sufi masters exert over their disciples. The Sufis' refusal to pay homes to the clerics is another sore spot. This tension is not just theoretical or limited to the classroom. Just 2 years ago, in February 2005, there was a major clash between the Iranian religious establishment backed by the government and a Sufi Khangah of the Nimat Allahi order in Qom, which left hundreds of Sufis arrested, many Sufis hospitalized, and their building completely destroyed and bulldozed within days. There's a fear among the Sufis in Iran that this could be a part of a larger strategy of the government to weed out Sufism out of Iran. And whether or not this is true, the event was clearly showed that Sufism was not welcome in Qom. I was fascinated to observe a new disciplinary approach to the study of world religions while I was in Qom. In the last 2 decades, there's been an explosion of interest in studying other religions through their own texts and authors for their own sake, rather than simply exploiting the knowledge for polemical ends. I had the fortune of working with several professors who had played key roles in this methodological shift, namely Professor Hussein Tawfiqi, Dr. Mohammed Legenhausen, and Dr. Mohammed Shamali, all well-known names in Jose. And this is a book by Mohammed Legenhausen in English, although it's been translated into Farsi and has had a lot of influence. His teachings, his books have had a lot of influence. His presence has had a lot of influence. He's on TV every week, just about. And in it, he critiques Western approaches to religious pluralism, but then seeks to find an authentically Islamic way to justify a form of religious pluralism in this book. And that approach has become very popular. Professor Tawfiqi has been working in the field of world religions in the Jose for nearly 50 years and was able to attest to the dramatic shift in focus that has occurred, as well as the rapidly growing increase in interest. Just 20 years ago, he explained to me, the only institute in Poland devoted to the study of other religions had a clear, overarching apologetic goal. Other religions were seen as a threat to the minds of the students and the population at large. And I just, for fun, had pulled off one of my bookshelf of an example of this kind of literature that has been the type of book that would be the primary reason for studying other religions, and this would be essentially a refutation of Christianity. Today, there are several rapidly growing institutes which focus on other religions. The most important of these institutes, and the largest, is the Markaz-e Adiyan, currently expanding, building a large new center on the outskirts of town. Markaz-e Adiyan publishes dozens of books each year on nearly every world religion, as well as an important journal, Haft al-Simon, The Seven Heavens. This is a journal that they publish, and a lot of scholars in Iran contribute to it. But as I hinted, it's not so much that the study of other religions is occurring in Qom that is so impressive, but the attitudes toward it has been exceedingly conciliatory and honest. There's been an explicit emphasis on translation and seeking to find common ground. And I just brought one book that's a translation of a number of different essays on penal justice and Judaism. And even this is in Farsi, of course, but the bibliography may be interesting to some of you to see what kind of works are being consulted and are being studied in this. The director of this institute has even publicly defended a pluralistic approach and has continued to receive support from many in the clerical establishment. Interestingly, one of my closest friends in Iran, Atal Amzadi, who is now working on his PhD at Rice University, translated a book by our own Stephen Katz into Farsi. Unfortunately, I don't have that work with me. Finally, let me just say that the work going on in Qom on world religions is also impressive because it is not limited or even heavily focused on the religions of the book, Judaism and Christianity, but has extended to religions less frequently researched by Muslim scholars, Buddhism, Confucianism, animism, and others. I apologize for the scattered nature of this presentation, and I have not here tried to conduct a systematic study of the Jose, nor have I touched on all of my experiences, even some that Professor Mason had mentioned. But I just wanted to give a few glimpses of some of the things that I found interesting about the scholarship that's going on in Qom today. I hope to give further academic attention to some of these issues during my time here. And if we have time, we can open it up for any questions that you may have about anything that I mentioned or any other aspect of living in Iran, or comments or observations.
Could you speak a little more about the mundane? You mentioned that the daily life was fairly mundane, and etc. What was it like for you initially, you and your wife, and then when you had a child, so on?
Well, I mean, frankly, the first year was fairly lonely. I mean, there's not any other Christians in Qom. There's fairly limited number of English speakers. Our Farsi wasn't that good early on. And so we spent most of our time just doing our studies, exploring the city to some extent. There's some of the enjoyable things to do in Qom that I thought I should have mentioned, one of which is there's a mountain, a small hill really, but it's called Ku'e Khizr because there is a famous story of someone seeing Khidr, that is the mystically interpreted green man mentioned in the Quran that plays so heavily in mystical literature and imagery, but is believed to have met someone there, and there's a small mosque on top of that hill which offers a great view of the city and often just a nice place to sit with families and talk and have small picnics. There's a few parks in the city that people like to go to. Unfortunately, Qom is it's unique in a lot of ways, and most of them are fairly unfavorable ways. I mean, Iranians are very free to admit that. Qawmis are free to admit this. I mean, the water in Qom is very salty, and it's very difficult to grow anything. So there's very few parks, and the parks that are there, if they have any grass, you can't actually touch or sit on it. You sit on the sidewalk and look at the grass. And so it's not, it doesn't have a lot to offer in terms of leisurely activities, except the scholarship. It really does revolve around the scholarship, and that's why people go there generally. But we did go to this Ku'e Khizr frequently, and like I said in the lecture, my favorite thing, honestly, to do in the whole city was to go visit the shrine, to go inside. We had sort of, guidebooks have said that non-Muslims aren't allowed to go into the shrine, not by Islamic law, but by laws of the government because of problems it had. We were specifically told by our hosts, and Ayatollah Misbah himself, that we should feel free to go to the shrine whenever we wanted. And so we did. And I went frequently just to sit and enjoy. It's a very, very wonderful, relaxing place to sit and watch people pray, listen to people recite the Quran, just to read a book yourself. Particularly enjoyed going on in the middle of 2 o'clock in the morning on the night of power to watch all the families that stay out in the courtyard and inside all night long, enjoying treats and praying. It's a very spiritual environment, very joyful environment. We enjoyed that aspect very much. But it was in the latter years we came to have closer friends. I mentioned Atta and Zali, who has come to the States the same year I came here. He's studying at Rice, and he's a close friend of ours. Who he and his wife had a daughter, just after we did, and so we shared stories of sleepless nights frequently. So we made friends as things went along, and then in the latter parts of our time in Iran, it was dominated by that, spending time with friends, people's houses, eating meals usually, and going to visit their families in other parts of the city, other parts of the country. We did a lot of traveling to other parts of the country as well. That was always a highlight. Yeah.
What did your wife wear? What was the sanitation like? And what were the medical facilities like?
Well, we of course drew, most of my points of comparison have been in the Middle East and the Arab world. And I was actually really surprised at how clean Iran was. Now, we always joked with one of our friends, Mohammed Legenhausen. Mohammed Legenhausen is a American convert to Islam, to Shiism, who has been living in Iran for the last 15 or 20 years as a professor. But he teaches in Pullman and became a friend of ours. He had never actually been to anywhere in the Arab world, and always talked about how he was so appalled by how dirty it was there. But the points of comparison meant a lot. Being in Egypt, in Cairo, I couldn't help but be just surprised at how clean Tehran was. It has a much more, again, in comparison to major cities in the Arab world, it has a much more European feel to it. More Iranians in general are very cosmopolitan, very international savvy, very fashion savvy. Of course, you see this in the Arab world as well, but it was striking. It's a little more just culturally, I think. To make just a huge gloss of this, which I'm embarrassed to do, but it did strike me as less of a cultural gap from sort of European and North American culture than the Arab world had. A lot more similarities I found, and you could go linguistically and argue that as well. But so the sanitation, the infrastructure in Iran is also very impressive, and the infrastructure in the cities has been well established for decades, but particularly the infrastructure in the villages was particularly impressive. That has been a major emphasis of the government since the Iranian Revolution in '79, was to bring all of the major amenities and services to all of the villages. They had a high emphasis on bringing literacy to all the population, have a very high literacy rate. So the villages have good roads, electricity, phone lines, internet cafes, even the smallest villages. So that was impressive. It's very good infrastructure. Fairly good sanitation. In terms of what my wife wore, that of course is dictated by two things. First of all, you have in Iran, you actually do have laws governing the use of a headscarf. So at bare minimum, anywhere she was at in Iran, she would need to wear some kind of a headscarf and a long shirt or a light jacket that would cover her waist. The more liberal families in Iran, especially famously the North Tehrani's, pushed us to the absurd limits of just tiny little strips of silk hanging over their head that sort of is supposed to be the veil. But then the other issue that you have is just cultural expectation living in Qom. Qom is, again, it's just a different place than most other places in Iran. In Qom, 99.9% of the women wear the chador over top of the veiling that they already have. So that the chador in Iran is this kind of huge, 10-foot wide piece of polyester, usually black, that you just kind of pull over yourself, hanging around your face like this, and then just kind of looks very sort of cape-like that you would wrap around your body. And it's too bad my wife's not here to tell you more about how she felt about that, but I'll speak on her behalf for the moment that she is very accustomed to using various kinds of veils from Pakistan to Yemen, various veils at various times, and she spent a summer in Afghanistan under the Taliban and wore the burqa several times, but hands down, the chador for her was the most impractical and difficult to manage veil of any in the Islamic world that she's come in contact with. It doesn't stay on, so you have to, like the burqa, you set on and it stays on. You have your hands free even if there's someone covered. The chador doesn't stay on by itself. You always, at the bare minimum, have to have one hand to hold it around your chin, to hold it on. So you only have one hand free at a time. It's a very difficult piece to manage. But the Iranians that wear the chador usually speak very highly of it. It's very much a source of pride or a source of national identity for those who look at it that way. I mean, others wouldn't, but it's a contentious issue inside Iran. Yeah.
Were you able to travel to Mashhad, and if so, did you experience any differences, specifically around the shrine of the Imam, with the attitudes of people, the atmosphere, especially the attitudes of the ulama? Was there differences between?
We did go to Mashhad. We didn't spend a lot of time there. We did go to the main shrine of Imam Reza. We unfortunately weren't allowed to enter to the inner court of the shrine. The shrine in Mashhad, I forgot when it was, decade, 15 years ago or so, had a very serious attack on it, who most Iranians believe was the Mujahideen Akhab, the sort of Marxist group that is often sort of trying to undermine the government. There was a suicide bombing there that killed a lot of people, and since that time, the shrine has been essentially closed off to visitors who aren't Muslim, even just foreign Muslim visitors sometimes have a hard time getting in. So we weren't allowed to go into the inner part there. But with the people that our hosts, we were on an MCC errand doing some work. MCC also continues to partner with the Iranian Red Crescent Society in Iran and fund some of their projects, humanitarian aid projects in Iran. And we were there representing MCC in that regard, meeting with Red Crescent Society. But our hosts, some of which were among the ulama, struck me as much more laid back. Mashhad seems to be more of a genuine place of relaxation and a less tense place. It's obviously a much bigger place and has just more diversity, internal diversity. I mean, Qom is diversity is scarce, really. I mean, in terms of there's academic diversity, but in terms of dress in terms of forms of entertainment, in terms of how you spend your free time in public, the diversity is more limited than a place like Mashhad, which is more sort of, again, more cosmopolitan, more international feel to it. Yeah.
How would you describe from your experience the differences between Shiism and Sufism in terms of religious experience?
Like the differences between Shia mystical experiences and
religious life, as you experience it, you know that Sufism has become a target of the state, perhaps, and that there is some problems. So do you see a difference between Shiism and Sufism at all?
Well, I mean that's, there's a lot of Shia Iranians who are Sufis, and it's not something that they usually proclaim from the rooftops, because it does have some sort of there's an element there in which it's not certain what your position is as a proclaimed Sufi. But I mean, there's Khangas in all the major cities, and Sufism is as such is fairly vibrant. But it has an underground nature to it. But I was struck more than that by the very widespread mystical, sort of what they would say irfani inclinations of the populace at large, and it often became a real source of commonality for Iranians that went like across the political spectrum. So when people didn't necessarily get along politically, you still had sort of these common sources. Particularly, I mean, Persian literature, of course, is so rich with mystical ideas that it sort of permeates the various groups, and everyone has their own ways of interpreting them. But it forms a very real bond that people can rely on. But mystical practices, mystical interest in mysticism, not always Sufism per se, but mysticism was very widespread, very encouraged by most of the Ayatollahs. A lot of literature on it. I mean, Khomeini himself is known for his mystical interpretations of some, of Islamic principles, and has written some on that. So there's been a real, stamp of authority on, the okaying of mystical understandings of the faith, and it's very, very widespread. I don't know if I answered your question correctly.
So what is the tension there with Sufism?
The tension is with the institutional organization of Sufism primarily, how the rituals have evolved to include practices that the ulama, the clerics, generally regard as objectionable. And often they are citing examples that aren't necessarily accurate for all Sufis or even most Sufis. Of course, they cite examples that maybe are fairly fringe examples, but the idea is there, and very common in the Jose at least, that the Sufis have developed rituals and practices, organizational methods, the murad and murid sort of relationship that doesn't have a foundation in Islam, is dangerous, leads to the danger of discarding the Sharia in favor of the inner goal. One of our professors used to always talk about, he sort of blanketly would state that the Sufis, as they look at the nut with the shell, seeing the shell as the Sharia, they they go through the shell and dispose of the shell, the Sharia, to get to the batin, the inner core of religion. But that's where they've gone astray, and that the Sharia is something that an important part of whatever, the goal itself that has to be kept. And this was sort of the blanket sort of write-off of Sufism, is that they depart from the Sharia in their goal of the true inner core that we recognize as well, is how they would say it. We recognize that this core is what we should seek, but we have to keep the Sharia as well. And as I mentioned, the Holmes tax is one of the professors that we were speaking with after this really awful attack in Qom about the situation. Really felt that the Holmes tax was one of the main issues, because the Sufis tend to give their Holmes tax. It's a 5% on profit, generally speaking, with some regulations given to the marja, your own marja, but the Sufis give it to their peer, and this particular scholar in Qom felt that was one of the main issues in Qom, was that they were not giving the Holmes tax to the appropriate people.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your disenchantment while you're at Bryan College, and then also I was wondering if you felt any similar feelings after you've been in Qom for a while, or if you saw any of those feelings in any of the students that you met there as well.
My experiences at Bryan College were something that I originally, after I left Bryan, felt sort of embarrassed about, because it's such a conservative institution. And later, it was only later, as I distanced myself from it some, that I began to realize what a really unique and interesting place it was. It's a very tight community of people who are able to share on a level that most academic institutions aren't able to, because of their shared religious traditions. I was personally disenchanted with, as I mentioned in the paper, some of what I felt was intellectual dishonesty. That there was a tendency to, at least I didn't feel like I was honest with myself in what questions I was asking and how I was trying to approach them. And when I spoke with professors on a more intimate individual basis, I found that a number of the professors agreed with me, but still just didn't feel like it was a healthy thing for the student body to go into those issues, to go into those questions, to pursue that path of thinking. And I think that was one of our problems. And I mean, my disenchantments with it go into a lot of just my own sort of reading of Christian theology and understanding of Scripture and how that's dramatically changed. But I have come back to sort of reaffirm the really unique and even valuable environment that this creates. I think there are some drawbacks that I saw occurring, at least what I think are drawbacks that I saw occurring in Qom as well, in Jose. But it does provide an intimacy and an ability to sort of, given certain religious assumptions or academic assumptions, to really work in a more extensive way at building sort of theological frameworks on top of those. It's a very scholastic thing, but I thought it was really fascinating. I mean, there were a lot of similarities between my experience in those two institutions. I didn't really answer your question. Do you have anything?
Well, I guess I was just wondering if there any more. You mentioned how you thought that one of the comments that one of your professors at Bryan College sort of mirrored things that your professors in Cologne would do. I was just wondering if there are any more examples of how they were either similar or different, or
not off the top of my head, and I don't want to waste time trying to think about them right now. A lot of things struck me over my time in Iran, and unfortunately I didn't take careful note of all those as they came to me, and was just bringing together a few that were still fresh in my mind in this lecture. But I'll have to think about that and get back to you.
You mentioned that there's this growing interest in religious studies, sort of the study of other traditions for the sake of those traditions. And I'm wondering if a particular tradition dominates, for instance, Christianity, or if it seems to be global in its interest, including, say, Hinduism, Buddhism, and particularly the status of perhaps the Ahmadiyya, or probably more pointedly for this community, the Baha'i, which you mentioned. How does the pluralism embrace these groups, and are there traditions that the pluralism tends to favor?
Yeah. Well, I did find that was an interesting aspect to me. Traditionally, as I understand from some of my professors' recollections, of past few decades, the majority of scholarship done on other religions has been mostly on Christianity and secondarily on Judaism and Zoroastrianism, which in Iran, Zoroastrianism is almost always included in people of the book category. But especially Christianity, largely because Christianity was seen as the largest threat with the Western influences in the country and the influx of Western missionaries that were there in the country. There was a very strong perceived need to combat the West and their Christian influences on the country. And so that sort of dominated scholarship for a long time. But like I said, Judaism and Zoroastrianism would also be right in there, or at least right after Christianity. And Iran has had a fairly significant Jewish and Zoroastrian community. The Jewish community, of course, has dwindled. I mean, all of the minority communities have dwindled, but the Jewish community is particularly small these days. And so those were more real concerns as well, whereas Buddhism and Hinduism and other religions were previously seen as unnecessary. I mean, there wasn't much contact, and there wasn't much respect for those religions in general, as them not being included of religions of the book. But there really is a significant change in that regard, and a lot of the scholarship going on in the Markaz Adiyan is completely outside of the traditional religions of the book religions. And Hinduism, Buddhism are definitely major topics of study. Sikhism, and various smaller groups like that and that's sort of really where the most sort of burgeoning of scholarship is going on. And then they're sending scholars, overseas to India, to other places to study even in this regard. The issue of what they would see as Islamically based heresies is a different story still. The Baha'i continues to receive almost exclusively polemical attention. Any sort of any sort of attempt, publishing, public format attempt to understand their point of view on their own terms and to respect that is honestly just not tolerated yet. And people that I spoke with myself about that issue just didn't feel that was in the interests of the community at this point. Yeah.
Are the Baha'is in Iran today?
Well, I mean, I'm sure there are.
There are.
But they're underground. I mean, it's not a legally recognized religion, so you're not going to be able to receive any official attention or any official status as a Baha'i, and you would, in certain communities, of course, really run a risk of actual persecution. And all of the Baha'i temples have been shut down and confiscated. So, but I'm sure that there are.
But Sikhism is embraced somewhat more as a distinct tradition.
Yeah.
It doesn't fall into the category of Islamic heresy.
Not exactly. Yeah. And I don't know as much about Sikhism, but I particularly noticed a couple of new books in my last year there on Sikhism, and they're again falling in line with the increasing sort of conciliatory approach of trying to, is looking at some of their poetry and some of their religious texts and drawing comparisons with, more traditional Islamic thoughts and sort of making, the common ground, the common establishment kind of thing, whereas doing that with the Baha'i faith is not okay yet. Do you have any questions?
At the school, were there any courses comparing the Shia jurisprudence with the four schools of Sunni?
Yeah, there are. I didn't take any of the courses myself, but I know both. There was at least one course on comparative jurisprudence at the institute that I was at, and I know that in Jose, in general, that's a topic people are generally expected to be fairly conversant in Sunni. I mean, those who go into fiqh are expected to be fairly conversant in the major issues of Sunni jurisprudence. And there were, I saw, just in terms of publications, there were a number of works continually being published and translated into English as well on that topic of comparing the schools of law. Yeah.
You mentioned a fairly prominent Ayatollah who's under house arrest, Ayatollah Muntaziri, however his name goes. Could you say a little bit more about that case? Why is he under house arrest?
Ayatollah Muntaziri is, I don't know a lot about it, but I'll tell you what I do know, or what I remember offhand, is that he's most famous because he was originally intended by Ayatollah Khomeini to be his successor as supreme leader of Iran. And that happened all the way right up until just, I think, a year or two before Khomeini died in the mid to late 80s. Khomeini began to feel that Muntaziri was taking Muntaziri was definitely making a shift in his understanding of the role of the ulama in government and some other issues that I'm not all that conversant in, but I know particularly some of his political ideas were taking a different approach than Khomeini was going with. And so Khomeini changed, no longer had him designated as a successor, and that whole process sort of changed anyway. And actually, and maybe you know, Dr. Swartz, I can't even remember the actual issue that originally put him under house arrest, but I think it was just a general condemnation of his of what he was teaching, if I understand correctly.
I don't know much about the case either. My sense is the same as yours, that he began to distance himself from Khomeini on certain issues, and that tension developed between them. I was in Iran in 1981, in connection with the celebration of, well, the first anniversary of the revolution, and I met Montazeri when I was there. Very impressive guy, and very, very warm, articulate. You know, I was a little surprised to hear that he's still under house arrest.
Yeah, he still is. But people are fairly free to visit him.
I see.
It's a fairly loose kind of house arrest. So he has a lot of people that come and visit him. He even does interviews occasionally still. And I mean, and there's a lot of Ayatollahs that don't actually leave their houses much either, in terms of their classes are done in their houses. Students are expected to go to them, and he's still sort of serves in that role, but officially he is under house arrest. And it's common knowledge and sort of a tension that continues in contemporary Iranian politics that the government has been fairly strict on some of the people who have held different interpretations of how the government should be ruled, despite the fact that there are legitimate, widely respected and acknowledged scholars, ayatollahs, grand ayatollahs, who differ. And the classic case in point is Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, who, of course, is sort of the favorite ayatollah in Iraq from the Iranian standpoint and from the ulama standpoint. But frankly, people realize that he doesn't believe in Baliyat al-Faqih, and he doesn't agree with Khomeini's understanding of how to rule the government according to Shiism. And if Sistani was in Iran, there would be real tensions on that issue. And that's part of why he stayed in Iraq. But with him staying in Iraq, you know, everybody's fine with overlooking that because he is such a highly revered and recognized scholar.
Did you gain any insights about the Iranian Kurdish population whose forebears actually were converted from Zoroastrianism? Was there any insight that you gained during your 3 years ago?
I wish that I could say that I did, but no, that's one area we didn't. We had only limited moments that we were anywhere near the Kurdish areas. I didn't have any friends of Kurdish background and never really got a chance to tap into that subject.
Stay on the political track for a second. Did you get any sense of the political sort of groupings of the clerics in Solomon? For example, in the Western press, you heard a lot, for example, about in the recent Assembly of Experts election, I think in December, that about 6 months previously, the conservative faction had sort of split into sort of the Mezba Yazdi camp, and they were going to run their own set of candidates, and then there was sort of the Rafsanjani clique, and Rafsanjani actually, I think, was in Qom. He came to speak and was actually physically somewhat assaulted while he was speaking in Qom. Were you there during any of that thing, or did any of those things sort of come up? And for example, you're being in a program that was associated with Mezba Yazdi, did that ever cause problems with other sort of groups in the city, or was it an asset, or was it?
Well, I mean, for us, it didn't cause problems because we were clearly enough on sort of the outside of things. It didn't really matter. People always expressed. I mean, there's always this kind of level of shock, you know, first that you're an American Christian in Iran at all. Second, that you're living in Qom, oh my gosh. Third, that you're studying with Ayatollah Mizpah. It's like off the charts, like people can't believe it, you know. It's just so weird to people. But it never caused a problem for us in particular, being clearly not involved. But you're right that there is, I mean, Ayatollah Mizpah holds a special reputation in Iranian politics, and he is a leader of his sort of school of thinking. And the most recent elections of the Assembly of Experts showed his followers, his group, and they don't work by parties so much as sort of schools of who you sort of is perceived to be your head, in which Ayatollah Misbah and Rafsanjani are sort of rival groups in that regard, and Rafsanjani's group had gained a lot of ground, a lot of votes, to the surprise of most people, including myself, in the recent election just a few months ago. So there is that dynamic, and that was fairly clear and obvious while we were there. There wasn't any hiding of that. I mean, and during the presidential elections, there was it was obvious that Ahmadinejad was Misbah's favored candidate of all of them, even before the breakdown between Rafsanjani and him. And he lobbied and sent his workers to campaign for Ahmadinejad fairly extensively. But so you have that dynamic, and what can I say? I mean, there's two different groups. Misbah is.
So I guess, how does it work? I mean, are there more than two groups? I mean, how do you become part of one group or part
There's
of
definitely
another?
more than two groups, and like I said, it's not, as far as I'm aware, there's no real party, formal party membership, but you sort of become fairly clearly aligned with a group leader. In this case, Misbah would be one, and Rafsanjani would be another, but there's others, and I'm not conversant in all the different leaders, but you have some that are based in and among the ulama, among the clerics, and you also have those who are based among what they call the Roshan Fiqh, the intellectuals, yeah. So, and you have groups of leaders among them as well. And I don't know, I'm not that an expert on the politics, but there are multiple groups. There's an array of groups, but Misbah's is fairly prominent.
Thank you. Unless there are more questions, David.
I have one quick
Don't want
question.
to.
Is there any sense as to who will be the successor to Khomeini, the current Ayatollah?
I did read a piece fairly recently on that issue, and I remember them mentioning someone, but it wasn't someone I knew well, and it's not with me. I couldn't comment on that right now. But people, of course, are thinking a lot about that.
Yeah, I would think.
But it's going to be a very big, important event who becomes the next Supreme leader. And that's, of course, where all the power lies, essentially. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.